Good evening. Thank you all for bearing the rain. You're the true believers in the educational experience that these types of events offer. But I'm glad you came out despite horrific weather and traffic. So thank you very much. Again, thank you for attending this event on Afghanistan withdrawal. I think it'll be a great conversation that we have. Before that, we're going to have Senator Webb give some remarks. But just to introduce myself, my name is Will Ruger from the Charles Koch Institute and the Charles Koch Foundation, and also an Afghan veteran, so I have a little bit of a stake in how this turns out. Again, we're really excited to have the Senator here in our panel. This is an important issue. It's critical. And let me just tell you a little bit about our guest tonight. So obviously, Senator Jim Webb from Virginia needs very little introduction given his illustrious career, not only as a war hero in Vietnam, but also as Secretary of the Navy and a great author, even a journalist. So thank you very much for coming here, Senator. We're also joined by Laurel Miller, who's at the International Crisis Group, and she was also the acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department. And Jason Dempsey, who is at CNAS, and also a retired lieutenant colonel and a PhD, so scholar, warrior, think tanker. So appreciate you all joining us. Given the president's desire to withdraw from Afghanistan and Ambassador Khalilzad's ongoing negotiations with the Taliban, we thought it would be valuable to bring this group together to discuss this 17-year-old plus conflict and how and why we should withdraw from America's longest war. And this is a critical issue right now. And over the next several months, the Charles Koch Institute will be doing a lot of work promoting educational opportunities through a request for proposal, for example, that we're issuing, but also through our own efforts at education in events like this. Because this is one of the things where America's safety, I think, will be best served by withdrawal. And then the question is how should we do that? And this tiers up to the Institute's efforts at rethinking American grand strategy, something that is long overdue. In fact, one could argue that since the end of the Cold War, we haven't had the kind of conversation that we need to on this issue. But this moment right now is one where things seem particularly plastic and there's a real opportunity for change. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic to Senator Webb. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Will, for that and for your comments about I think the need for our country to really sit down and try to have good, strong discussions about what our strategy really ought to be. Thank all of you for coming. I was driving over here and first I was going, Will, why did you pick this place? I took an hour from Virginia to get here. I didn't know when I started how long it was going to take me to get here. And I was thinking about an event I was in Tennessee many years ago with a very revered former governor, and people kept coming up and telling him at the beginning of the event how much they admired his service, and he finally just said, look, I don't care how many people like you, when it comes to your funeral, it's going to depend on the weather. So what I thought I would do in the time that I have, and I'm going to be with you just at the beginning of the event of a family obligation tonight, would be to talk a little bit about why I think these types of events are important in terms of our ability to really discuss foreign policy in this town. And then second, give my thoughts on the region itself and where I think we have gone astray, and how we need to redefine our imprint in that part of the world. And then thirdly, just a bit about Afghanistan. I was there as a journalist in '04. It looked a lot different than it does now. And then turn it over to the people who are really going to give you a serious in-depth discussion of the proposal or the idea that we might withdraw or otherwise redefine our presence there. The starting point for me when I think about foreign policy, whenever we make these sorts of commitments, is do they fit our national security interest? And my belief in particular with this region is that you can address the United States national security interest without having large static forces on the ground. I think it detracts from our ability to deal in a world where there's so many different conflicting interests, and always have been for the last probably 2,000 years. And in this town, I don't see that kind of debate. In the long experience I've had in and out of government, I've seen less and less of that debate when it comes to the formal think tanks and these sorts of groups. There's been sort of a convergence that wasn't there even during the Vietnam War into a foreign policy elite, for lack of a better word, and a quiet agreement on some of the principles that in the rest of the country people may not agree with. I think back on the invasion of Iraq, the anniversary of the invasion was just a couple of days ago, and 6 months before the actual invasion of Iraq, I'd become so concerned about the direction of the debate from 9/11 into the point that we were doing that I wrote a piece for the Washington Post. It was a very hard piece for me to write because I have so many friends who are in the military and who otherwise were involved in the formulation of policy. But I just basically said, take a look at this. This is a strategic blunder. It's going to empower Iran. In the long term, it's going to empower China in terms of the attention that it's going to distract from our policies in that crucial part of the world. And I made an analogy of when we went into Japan at the end of World War II and how Douglas MacArthur had handled our movement into Japan, and 50,000 American soldiers immediately became 50,000 friends. And I said, if you go into Iraq, 50,000 soldiers are immediately going to become 50,000 terrorist targets. That did not make me a very popular person in the think tank world or in the foreign policy bureaucracy, including a lot of my friends. I temporarily lost out a lot of my friends for a few years until this thing started turning around. And at the same time, like a lot of people, perhaps in this room, I had a son who dropped out of college and enlisted in the Marine Corps and went into Ramadi during some of the really hard fighting in Ramadi as an infantry lance corporal, knocking down doors. So that is the duality, I think, of a lot of us who have spent our lives looking at American foreign policy around the world. On the one hand, we can debate these issues, and on the other hand, there's a strong tendency in my family and in a lot of families around America that when the country calls you, you go. But these types of discussions don't often happen when you get into some of these other places. And so I am very appreciative that you're holding this discussion tonight. With respect to the region, I have to say, our misdirection in this part of the world actually began about 32 years ago. When I was Secretary of the Navy. Actually, during the interim period between when I was nominated, I was serving as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and before my confirmation hearing, it was announced that we, the United States, we're going to reflag Kuwaiti vessels, oil vessels coming out of the Persian Gulf as American vessels. And this was about 2 months after the revelations of the Iran-Contra event, where it was discovered that we had been sending weapons to Iran and because we were trying to get hostages out of places in the Middle East. And the tilt in reflagging Kuwaiti vessels was toward Iraq. And I was in the bleachers when this decision was made, when the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and the CIA director got together and this policy was announced. But it seemed to me to be just a message to that part of the world that we had not tilted toward Iran. The Kuwaiti vessels had to go through the Persian Gulf, and it was viewed by many as a provocation of Iran. And then in our policies, it was, well, we're not going to allow the Iranians to go after these Kuwaiti vessels. Parentheses, Kuwait was the #1 ally of Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war. So on the one hand, we had tilted toward Iraq visibly. On the other hand, about 2 or 3 months after I became Secretary of the Navy, an Iraqi aircraft attacked an American ship, the USS Stark, in the Persian Gulf, and in my recollection, 37 sailors were killed in that Exocet attack. And the Iraqi government said it was an accident. He thought it was an Iranian ship or whatever. But you just began to see how complicated this region was. And everybody wanted to play. Once the Q-80 vessels went in under the American flag, then everybody in our defense establishment wanted to play in the Persian Gulf. We put special forces in there. We brought minesweepers all the way from the West Coast in a sort of a humiliating voyage, these old Korean War vintage minesweepers through Hawaii into the Persian Gulf at the same time that the Saudis had just bought 13 brand new minesweepers, and according to our people in the Pentagon, they didn't have crews that would be able to use them. I was asking them at the time, well, then why don't you send American advisors onto the Saudi minesweepers, and then maybe they can get their crews up to speed. But anyway, I sent a series of memoranda to Cap Weinberger, who I have great admiration for as Secretary of Defense, but as Secretary of the Navy, questioning what we were doing. Why are we doing this? Why are we getting involved in this war between, as Weinberger used to say, the worst regime in the world and the second worst regime in the world, and nobody could figure out which was which. And then from that, within a few years, we were at war with Iraq over Kuwait when they had gone into Kuwait. And then I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal saying Milo Minderbinder would be proud. We saw the Iraq War. We've seen the incursions in Libya. We've followed what's gone on in Syria. Somebody's waving a number for hit me back in the back of the room. And then, finally, we've had a situation that reminds me very much of when I was a journalist in Beirut in 1983, which Will asked me to recount. I was on an outpost with the Marine unit, and one engagement with a Druze unit when a Lebanese army unit below us ended up being the Syrians coming over the mountain and a phalange group shooting, and a sergeant turned around to me and said, "Sir, never get involved in a five-sided argument." That to me is the region. And quickly with respect to Afghanistan, because my time is running out in the back of the room, and I'm going to defer to the people who really have the expertise on what's going on right now. Afghanistan, I think, started as the way we should have approached terrorism in that part of the world. It was a maneuver element war at the beginning. It was going after specific targets in the national security of the United States. When I was a journalist in Afghanistan in 2004, there was still a lot of that. I was out with the Marine Corps unit, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines in Tarin Kowt, which just made the news in the New York Times last week. And they were maneuvering. They weren't trying to build static positions, but there was a transition you could see then. And now we got into this policy of nation building, and frankly, we do have to get away from that. We have to find a way to reduce the footprint in this part of the world. We should not be occupying territory in this part of the world, and at the same time guaranteeing our national security interests. I think we can do that. I think we can do that without having these forces on the ground in the way that they have been over the past probably 15 years. Two words of caution, or two points of caution before I finish. One is that I don't know. I would be interested in the comments on this, but if I were involved in a policy situation right now, I'd be a little nervous about the signals that are being sent to the rest of the world with the Americans sitting down just talking to the Taliban, if you really want to make the proper kind of an exit. And the second one is, there's a rule I learned in law school called the rule of negligence. And I think it applies whenever we put people into places like this. And it triply applied in Vietnam, because I still strongly believe in how that could have turned out if it had been different. But that is, if you're walking by a pond and you see somebody drowning in that pond, you have no legal obligation to help them. But if you start helping them, you have a duty. You have incurred a duty. And that's the way that we need to approach these issues when we are actually transitioning into a different type of presence. Abruptness without some sort of guarantee about where our national security interests are and people who legitimately were with us is not a good policy. So with that, I thank you for having invited me, and I thank you for your attention while I've been speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite Laurel and Jason to come on up now, and we'll start the panel here as soon as they get up here. So I think Senator Webb gave us a lot of food for thought, and it was a good introduction to this panel, and he nicely handed it off saying that he'd like to learn from you, and so would I. So thank you again for joining me. And I think let's step back. Senator Webb talked a little bit about the history of the region, and I want to focus in on Afghanistan and the United States and talk about the war's history. So I guess the question for you, Jason and Laurel, is why did we go into Afghanistan in the first place? This is a war that started over 17 years ago, so some of the people in the room and in the audience on the TV here are people who may have been in grade school or not even born yet, in the case of my kids who are watching. So why did we go in, and what were the original objectives? And have we achieved these objectives? And then how can we know when we can be done? So Jason, you want to start us off?
One, thanks for hosting. I think it's amazing how few conversations we have about Afghanistan, which is part of the reason why we are where we are. In terms of why we went in and how that happened, I think the key is we have to recognize that we went in for a very specific reason in terms of retaliation against the attacks on 9/11. We wanted to take down the Taliban, but then that quickly morphed. And that morphed through a very special, unique American blend of arrogance and ignorance. And one of the more fascinating anecdotes of the early years there that I always go back to is when Richard Armitage was in the State Department. And shortly after 9/11, a Pakistani offered to come in and brief him on the history of the Taliban and how that whole Pashtun area had intersected with Pakistani policy, et cetera. And Armitage's response was, I don't need that briefing, I don't want it. History starts today. And so there's this very unique blend, this ahistorical idea, again, this uniquely American arrogance and optimism that suggests that American exceptionalism doesn't even just mean that we do things really well, but somehow the laws of physics don't apply to us. And so when we walked into Afghanistan, we jettisoned any idea that we needed to pay attention to why previous efforts from the Russians, from the British, from countless conquerors and invaders had all ended up failing. And with that all.
Yeah. So we basically, we accomplished the goal of punishing the Taliban largely, and we've treated al-Qaeda as an effective force with the intent and capabilities to hit the United States, at least in Afghanistan. So Laurel, do you think we've accomplished our goals, and when can we know whether we ought to be done?
Well, I think first, there are somewhat different versions of precisely what the goals were at the outset. There's a more expansive version of that. I mean, when you actually talk to people who were involved in those decisions, there's a narrower version of that and a more expansive version of that.
Right.
The narrower version is we had to get al-Qaeda. We needed Osama bin Laden turned over to the United States, and that we only overthrew the Taliban because of their refusal to turn over al-Qaeda, and this was a way to achieve our objectives specifically vis-a-vis al-Qaeda, without a whole lot of thought about the significance of overthrowing the Taliban. And even in one version of this, some reluctance to overthrow the Taliban because of an understanding of what that could imply. The more expansive version is that the United States needed to demonstrate to all current and future potential state sponsors of terrorism around the world that the United States was not going to stand for state sponsorship of terrorism, and to make an example of the Taliban and an example of Afghanistan. I think the fact that there even now isn't precise clarity about what the going in objectives were is fairly telling as to the story as it developed thereafter, and the ways in which the objectives grew and morphed, and one thing led to another, and it became a very open-ended set of objectives that ultimately, by some years into this, became a sort of preventive war. That, well, okay, we've largely dealt with al-Qaeda, but al-Qaeda could pop up again, and it is entirely decimated, and now you have a still fragile situation in Afghanistan, and if you don't stabilize that situation in Afghanistan, these problems could emerge again. But one of the things that I observed even many years into this when I was in government is that there was still a constant questioning of, well, what exactly is our interest? What exactly is our objectives and goals? And the fact that you had to, in 2013, 14, 15, and now be asking that question suggested that there was really not clarity on what you would think would be the most fundamental point.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was that it depended on who you asked.
Right.
Particularly if you talked to NGOs while you were there, you'd think that it was much broader than anything you just said.
Right.
Was why particularly the United States military was there. And then the question is, even for those goals, was the United States military the best tool in the toolkit to achieve those?
Just to comment on that, the tactics start to develop a logic of their own. So building Afghan civil society, strengthening the Afghan government, those weren't goals of the United States in and of themselves. I mean, those were instruments for achieving other goals. And I think similarly, some of the actions that the U.S. took in building up the security forces and working with them, but they start to develop a self-perpetuating logic of their own.
Right, so Jason, in terms of population-centric counterinsurgency, which is one of these tactics that became the strategy, what was the flaw there? I mean, why are we in the situation we're in? Is part of it that approach to the conflict, the expansion of the war aims, which necessitated those tactics?
There's a deeper question that leads to the issue you're bringing up, and that is the utter distance and ignorance that the majority of the American public has about the true capabilities of the United States military. The image of the American military as the most popular national institution in America has morphed into this idea over the last 20, 30 years, outgrowth of probably the first Gulf War, and then the immediate aftermath of 9/11, that somehow it's this mystical, magical golden hammer that can solve all problems. And, oh, by the way, they seem fine with the mission. It's not costing us too much, so let's just let them run on autopilot. They can figure it out. But what we were asking the military to do, and what the military said it could do, was a fundamentally absurd proposition. But we have a hard time grappling with that because it's a distant thing. It's like, well, Afghanistan's complicated. Those guys must know what they're doing. And so if I could, I'd throw out just a really quick analogy that I wrote about a couple weeks ago, and that is, to take it out of the context of the military might be confusing. Imagine that in this room, us here, we are the collective board of the Marriott hotel chain. Imagine that all of us just got back from this great little team building jaunt in Western Mongolia. Right? Western Mongolia is generally unpaved, no electricity, very nomadic lifestyle. Everybody lives in yurts. It's kind of a steppe lifestyle, but we loved it. But we as Marriott say, you know what they need in Western Mongolia? They need a Marriott hotel. So let's build them a modern Marriott hotel. That's absurd. That's the fundamental problem. Was we said to Afghanistan, we're going to turn you into something that looks like something we like, even though there is no structure to support it. but then it actually gets more absurd in execution. And what I mean by that is, if you then as a collective board had decided that, and you said, Jason, go figure out how the military is going to do that, or how Marriott should do that. And I came back to you the next morning and said, I got it, boss. Last night I stayed in the local Marriott here in Washington, D.C. It was great. It was clean, it was efficient, it was profitable. Let's send the manager of that Marriott to Western Mongolia and have him oversee the construction of a new Marriott hotel. Now, it's not his primary mission, so we're not going to be sure that he speaks the local language. We're not going to train him on contracting. We're not going to train him on local culture, laws, none of that. And oh, by the way, we're only going to keep him there for 9 months because we have more important things going on here with Marriott hotels in the United States. And so we're just going to rotate guys in and out every 9 months. If I propose that plan to you collectively, you would throw me out of the room. But the difference between Marriott and the way we treat our American military is that Marriott has an engaged board that pays attention to what it's doing, and it has shareholders who care about return on their money.
So that's a pretty depressing scenario you paint. And look, the American military has a kind of can-do spirit. People have talked about this, like Andy Basovich, and so they tried to do it. I think we should honor the people who tried to do that. They weren't the decision makers, but what were the decision makers thinking? I mean, and I guess the question for you both is, what should they have been thinking? Like, what are the actual interests in Afghanistan that the United States has, and what would have been the best way to secure that? Laurel?
Well, I think that it should have been seen earlier on that finding a way to accommodate the Taliban in Afghan politics was the most realistic way to end the insurgency and have some prospect of a reasonably stable Afghanistan that we could leave behind. There were times over the last 17 years when there were opportunities to do that, some of which were recognized and some of which weren't. I mean, in the early few years of the after the U.S. invasion, the Taliban actually tried to initiate efforts to reconcile in a very Afghan fashion with other Afghans. And the U.S. didn't even perceive that as an opportunity at the time. Later, it became an element of U.S. policy by sort of notionally starting in 2009, more affirmatively by early 2011, so a full 8 years ago. Right. But starting even 10 years ago, it was an element of U.S. policy already many recognizing that the war was not going to be won militarily and that there needed to be a diplomatic effort to end the war. And that was never, until very recently, fully embraced as the centerpiece of American strategy, in part because of the overwhelming influence, in my view, in part because of the overwhelming influence of the U.S. military on policymaking in Afghanistan, and a sense and a belief that if you could just do a little bit more, go a little bit further, turn the next corner, you were somehow at least going to be in a strong enough position to negotiate from a superior position and be, negotiating the terms of the Taliban's surrender rather than some kind of compromise with the Taliban. But you could once the decision to overthrow the Taliban and to, in the aftermath of that invasion, not include them in the original political settlement of all the other Afghan factions or representatives or elements of the Taliban in that political settlement, I think you were left with options for negotiating later that were bypassed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You're talking about winning. And again, it gets back to this issue we started with about the unclear objectives. But is there, given the expansion of the objectives, driven in part by the tactics we chose, was there any way actually that we could have won? I think that we could have won the war in a sense if we had had a much clearer understanding about what was actually necessary. Like we talked about at the beginning, really making sure we're treating al-Qaeda and punishing the Taliban leadership, at least in some way, such that you could then credibly say to the rest of the world, don't mess with us in the way that the Taliban did by supporting terrorist actors. But that was accomplished well before. I mean, at the latest, you could say that was 2011. It could have been said it was even earlier. But my question is given the expansion of the use of those tactics and the expansion of the war aims by many, was it even possible with even the number of troops we had there after Obama's surge? And then certainly the question is even if today we said we still had to do all those things that are part of that expanded war effort, could you do that with 14,000 troops, even if you include the 312,000 forces in the ANA and the ANP?
I mean, the fact is today with 14,000 troops, the situation's getting worse and worse. So it's not, to me, logical to assume that if you could just reach some sort of steady state with a tolerable level of U.S. commitment that just holds it together enough to buy the Afghans, the non-Taliban Afghans, time to resolve the problems themselves. My view is many of the aims were unrealistic. Yes, there are many things that could have been done better, in a sense of more efficiently or more effectively or with a better understanding of the situation. But the expansive set of aims that developed, I don't think were realistically achievable. That's not to say that nothing's been achieved in Afghanistan. I mean, there have been outputs that have resulted from the American and other international inputs. There is an army. There are some elements of the army that are reasonably effective. There is a less effective police force. There have been gains in terms of health and education, et cetera. So I don't want to give the impression that nothing positive has happened for all of the American investment. But the idea that you could, in the kind of time span that was ever realistic for a large American intervention, make all of those gains self-sustaining without the external inputs, that I think was unrealistic.
So why don't we just do if our critics were asking us, why not just do something bigger and longer? If it's that important that we stay and achieve these goals, why don't we have the generational effort that the counterinsurgency, manual talks about? Why don't we, stay at those higher levels of troops? Is it because we wish the ends, but we can't will the means, Jason?
Afghanistan's a fundamentally fractious state, right? It's never been controlled by a strong central government. And so a lot of the solution we're trying to impose on Afghanistan assumes that will somehow magically come into being. And I think when we talk about large troop numbers, we talk about continuing to take the fight to the Taliban, but then we never question, well, how is this force able to even stay alive given all that we are throwing at them? Everybody likes to talk about sanctuaries. Well, I guarantee you we're pumping more money, material, and support into Afghanistan than is coming to the Taliban via Pakistan. Similarly, we're fighting an enemy with exactly zero air assets, and yet they're still able to claim and hold terrain. And so the question we haven't gotten to, and the really hard question that has never been had is, there's two hard questions. One, or two hard discussions that need to happen. One is with the Americans, Khalilzad and others, with the Afghan government to say, hey, this is happening and let's get you involved in this. The other conversation that's never happened is an actual conversation with the American people that says, hey, guess what? We can't have it all. We have to make some really hard decisions, and these are the decisions we're going to make. And we're actually going to have to give and cede some of even our moral principles on the edges to get at our core interest, because we cannot remake the state. And the problem with this generational struggle is, the generational struggle, at least as we have attempted to execute it, is, again, let's build a military that assumes the existence of a state with effective central bureaucracies, a lack of sectarian division, lack of corruption, rule of law, an educated populace, right? Things that simply don't exist, but somehow we'll continue to prop up this military, and then somehow by magic, we'll get a legitimate central government, without ever acknowledging that the reason the Taliban are able to maintain the success that they have is because they are able to push a compelling narrative, whether we like it or not, to a lot of rural Afghans. And we are defending, ultimately, a government that does not have validity across the country. There are a lot of great people in it. There are a lot of great patriots, a lot of great military folks that I love to this day. But that government is not winning the messaging battle, and they're not with us propping them up. So this continued idea of, well, let's just do it for generations means we'll just continue to fail for generations.
I guess I would just add to that, part of the problem with the generational concept is it doesn't acknowledge the friction that is created by the U.S. presence there. Yep. We see ourselves as a stabilizing force, but in many respects in that environment, we're a disruptive force. First, related to the narrative point that Jason referenced, the Taliban narrative is we are the defenders of Afghan sovereignty, dignity, integrity, and the presence of the foreign invaders on Afghan soil is what is the rallying cry for the Taliban and the recruitment slogans for the Taliban. We're also disruptive with respect to the other side of the equation in that we have created a set of incentives for the power holders associated with the Afghan government and with the government itself that is distorting of what might be a more organic equilibrium in Afghanistan. And so I don't think that a just perpetual presence of the United States there has a kind of stabilizing effect in the way that, say, the American presence in Japan over a long period has. Yeah. It's also not comparable, I think, to some of these other multi-generation presences in the sense that Afghanistan isn't such a useful place to us. I mean, so long as we're there, we're going to be fighting a counterinsurgency because our presence there is what motivates the insurgency.
Yeah, and Jason, you talked about the government in Afghanistan, and one of the premises seems to be that you have to have a legitimate government, a central government that is providing justice to the people and is relatively non-corrupt for that part of the world. And very few of those factors can actually be achieved. And actually the American military presence, like Laurel is saying, not just the military presence, but the presence of our money actually makes some of those challenges even harder in terms of the corruption. Is that your sense, Laurel?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of documentation of the ways in which American spending there has fueled corruption. Again, I don't want to suggest that that's all that it's done. I mean, there have been positive effects as well. But I think many people who have looked at this closely believe that in a sense we've spent too much money, particularly in the early years, and the absorptive capacity of the system to effectively utilize that money has been somewhat limited.
So let's look forward. Where do we go now? If you were advising Ambassador Khalizad, what would you be telling him about whether we should be negotiating with the Taliban? Senator Webb mentioned this. Should we be doing that bilaterally? Should we be involving the Afghan government as well, or is it more effective to do it this way? And what is the history here that relates to these negotiations? Laura?
So there was a long series of efforts, sporadic efforts with a lot of ups and downs from this early period that I mentioned in 2010-11 when the U.S. adopted a policy of trying to find a way towards a negotiated settlement. The long-standing obstacle to getting a peace process going was the Afghan government's and the U.S. insistence on the format for a peace process being with the Afghan government, Taliban, and the U.S. at the table, and the Taliban's resistance to negotiating with the Afghan government. The Taliban has long been willing to negotiate with the United States and has explicitly preferred a sequenced approach in which first it negotiates with the United States over the American troop presence. Fine, we can talk about your counterterrorism concerns too. And then after we've achieved our primary objectives, that is achieving a commitment from the United States to troop withdrawal, then we will negotiate with other Afghans. For a long period of time, the US and Afghan government resisted that Taliban preference, and therefore negotiations just never really got going. Right. So what's changed recently is that the US changed its position on what it would tolerate in terms of a peace process, and has essentially conceded to the Taliban their preferred sequence of negotiating, and that's what's led to the recent breakthrough. The premise of that from Ambassador Khalilzad's perspective is that it doesn't mean that the United States is abandoning the idea of there needing to be a dialogue and negotiations among Afghans about the political future of the country, but that he's trying to sort of wedge open the space for that by proceeding with these bilateral talks with the Taliban. There's a logic to that, particularly at a time when there's a lot of political pressure and urgency and the known positions of the president on this. There's a lot of risk in that as well, because there's a reason why the Taliban has long had this preference, which is you fundamentally affect the negotiating dynamics among Afghans if the Taliban gets essentially their big win up front. I think in terms of where we go immediately in the next steps from here, the question is how far should the United States go in this bilateral negotiation with the Taliban before you even have the rest of the negotiation involving other Afghans underway? If you go too far in the US-Taliban negotiations, all the way to the point of concluding a drawdown agreement, which is really just an exit agreement but not a comprehensive peace agreement, there's pretty high risk that you develop, you sort of reinforce a momentum in Washington towards withdrawal, irrespective of whether there's actually a peace agreement, and you weaken the ability of the Kabul side of the negotiations to negotiate effectively.
Jason, do you think that ultimately the United States' interests are best served by withdrawing one way or another fully out of Afghanistan? And when I say fully, I don't mean withdrawing our ability to conduct diplomacy or to engage economically, or even to use ISR capabilities or special operations forces as needed to hit terrorists, but withdrawing that kind of footprint that we have there now.
Certainly withdrawing the footprint we have now. Because again, the footprint we have now is merely propping up an artificial structure. And so to Laurel's point about these conversations and how they're impacting the Afghan government, it's kind of a wake-up call for the Afghan government to figure out, okay, what does this actually look like? It's also a wake-up call for us, because what we're going to witness here is a controlled collapse of the Afghan state as it's currently propped up. Right? There is no scenario by which the Afghan government sustains and maintains a 350,000 person security force. Right? Simply, it will not happen. So what does that actually look like as that force attrits, withdraws, collapses? Right? What becomes part of their central interest? What do they protect? What do they not protect? And that's a conversation that's very valid to have. And I think the key is, it goes to the timeline argument. I was always fascinated by those who said, well, we're losing because we told them when we were going to come out. And I said, well, that's kind of absurd, because while valid, there were always two sides to the timeline argument. And it wasn't the messaging to the Taliban that the timeline was in place for. The messaging was to the Afghan government that said, by this certain date, we expect you to have something that you can sustain on your own. And we will leave at that point, so get serious about what works. Now, of course, we weren't very fair to them, because we continued to impose this massive artificial structure on them and wouldn't let them figure things out, which will, in many ways, look like warlords, patronage, corruption from Western eyes, but it'll look to Afghans like, okay, I got it. My family's back over here. My tribe is now in charge of this. We will protect this, but by God, we don't care about Helmand. And those are the kind of decisions that have to be made. And I'm hoping that we can do it in a way, I don't know, that's a controlled collapse, I guess, from our large aspirations to something that can protect our core interests, that can protect the people who've been willing to fight with us for so many years, but also come up with a realistic solution sustainable by the Afghans.
It seems that the most important thing that could come from these negotiations, or just period, the most important thing for us is to make sure that something like what happened pre 9/11 doesn't happen again. So the question, the $64,000 question, for those of us who remember that old TV show, is really, can we trust, say, the Taliban, if there is this controlled collapse and the Taliban comes back into power, in a major way, either in Kabul or as part of a kind of Afghan version of Pashtunistan. Can we trust the Taliban on the issue of terrorism? And yes, if they say yes, we will not let an Al-Qaeda-like force develop, specifically anti-American activities here. Can we trust them in that? And do we need to trust them, or can we actually verify, if you will, through our capabilities, kind of offshore, so to speak?
I mean, I would hate to use the word trust and Taliban in the same sentence.
Right.
But I would say, I think, given the set of options that are actually before us,
Some realism.
given what is happening on the ground in Afghanistan, the increasingly fragile political system, the increasingly difficult security situation, I think the United States is much better off with a negotiated exit from Afghanistan that is a negotiation with the Taliban and with the government and other Afghans than it is with an exit without a negotiation, or an exit that is just a negotiation with the Taliban and then leaving the Afghans to sort the rest out among themselves in a way that will lead to a lot of disruption in the situation and make any counterterrorism assurances, I think, unreliable. So I think what gives the United States the best chance of being able to not entirely rely on the insurances, but to mitigate the risks of unreliability is to fold the Taliban into mainstream politics in Afghanistan, make them part of the security system in Afghanistan, incentivize them to have relations with the outside world, which they say they want to have, that they want the American military to leave. They don't want the American development assistance to leave. They didn't get, at least didn't directly get the benefit of the gravy train over the last 17 years. So now, they want to have a shot at it.
Right.
But there is some incentivization to be done there along with other donors. And, I don't want to say I'm optimistic that will all work out, but that approach, I think, gives you the best chances. But I would, at the same time, be looking for other alternative means of keeping your eyes on the core counterterrorism interests. And I think there you have to look outside of Afghanistan, and that the key is, as unpalatable as it is to some in this town, the key is to rebuild up U.S. counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan, because I don't think you can just rely on truly offshore capabilities from Qatar or other places. The threshold for re-entry in Afghanistan to deal with anything that is going on there, once you're out, I think will be politically quite high. And so you're going to need some kind of regional relationships. And, Pakistan is, the locus of a lot of the problems, but also has a lot more actual capabilities than I would foresee Afghanistan having anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think, given the way Washington talks about the importance of American leadership, oftentimes we talk as if other states can't also be helpful in this part of the world, or might actually have to own some problems that they would rather, kind of buck pass on to us. And so Barry Posen at MIT, for example, has talked about how if we leave, it's not as if there won't be other states that will have some incentive to deal with some of the challenges there. and could act potentially as stabilizing forces, or could act in a way that actually means they have to own a problem that right now we're having to own. But Jason, what do you think we shouldn't do in this process as we move to Q&A here? What shouldn't we do?
Well, for one, I fully agree with Laurel's characterization. If I could just hit on that real quick, is that we've unfortunately allowed the debate to be framed in that 1% doctrine, right? Zero chance, right? We have to be in Afghanistan until there's zero chance we will ever be attacked from there. And that's a standard we don't hold to any other country on earth, many of whom have the greater capacity to harm our interests directly than Afghanistan does. And so I think we need to recalibrate the way we look at that, get over this sunk cost mentality that says we have to win it definitively, and by God, there could never be anyone else who ever says a bad word about the United States in Afghanistan. It's simply unachievable. And oh, by the way, our continued presence, again, causes some of these frictions that we're going to have a hard time dealing with. To your question, Will, on what should we not do, and it goes back to kind of this controlled withdrawal that Laurel talked about. That's what we absolutely have to do. Because the option if we don't, right, we're the guy in the bar who says, I'm the toughest guy, I can beat up anybody, I don't need any friends. That guy doesn't last very long, right? You gotta have friends, you gotta work with folks, or you eventually get your ass kicked because people gang up on you. So to Laurel's point, one, work the region in ways that we haven't before, i.e. from a position of cooperation, not of arrogance. And then two, have these conversations with the American people as we're going. Because if we continue to pretend that we can have it all, right, then at some point we just want to walk away. And obviously the most dangerous course of action in all of that would be the privatization of our efforts in Afghanistan. And ironically, it's the same, that idea has been allowed to grow and get traction because those arguing for it often are able to articulate the problems with our current strategy in ways that others are unwilling to. But unfortunately, it doubles down on all the problems we have in Afghanistan. Right? One, it completely would disengage the public from whatever is going on there. And even though we might not hold contractors accountable for war crimes and missteps and corruption, right, the American public, or excuse me, the Afghan public does not see any difference between a gringo in a contractor outfit and a gringo in a uniform. They will blame everything on the Americans, and it will come back to haunt us. And so it's that lack of accountability there. Ultimately, the way I'd say this, it's our arrogance and ignorance around this has kind of put us in the situation, a false choice between delusional optimism, which will lead to failure, and rational evil, which will lead to a really poor outcome.
So I'll take a little bit of a moderator's privilege, because I think this is what all three of us are saying, is that we really need to be guided by some serious political realism, to not engage in kind of nirvana fallacies, unicorns existing, and therefore, if we have to have the presence of unicorns to get where we need to go, we're really in trouble. And so I think I applaud both of you for bringing a dose of that realism. What can we actually achieve? What are the real constraints we face? What do we actually have to do as opposed to what we need to, what do we need to do as opposed to what we would like to do? And that realism seems to have been missing for 17 years, but I am heartened, I guess, some optimism, that President Trump and Ambassador Khalilzad seem to, I think, have a sense that what we've been doing can't continue forever. Unlike what you've seen from some of the generals who have said, things are getting better every year, things are right around the corner, we'll be able to make this turn, which will lead us to have the foot on their kind of throat, and therefore we'll negotiate the deal that we would say will never actually happen. So again, applaud that realism. But let's go to questions from the audience. And I'm told that it's very important that we use Chris Preble's Jeopardy rule, that it has to be in the form of a question. I think that's really important. Mim, if we have any questions, please raise your hand and you'll be acknowledged. And please, if you can, state the institution you're coming from.
My name is Dan Caldwell. I'm the Executive Director of Concerned Veterans for America. Do you think that re-equipping the Afghan security forces with American and European weapons has diminished their effectiveness when compared to using the old Soviet bloc stuff they literally grew up with in some cases.
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, there's no question about it, right? I mean, the Russian helicopters that we insisted they stop using, those are the AK-47 of helicopters, right? And the reason the AK-47 is so ubiquitous is because you can throw it in the mud, you can pick it up, it'll likely still fire, you can teach somebody to take it apart and conduct maintenance on it in a fairly short amount of time. You can't do that with American weapons. You certainly can't do it with the Black Hawk helicopter. You know, I think we should all tip our hat continuously to John Sopko, who's the only one calling BS on a lot of the things going on over there. I mean, we have a plan right now. I think it's 168 Black Hawk helicopters will be in the hands of the Afghans by 2022, and there's no out clause for the U.S. government not to deliver those if they're not ready. Right? We're still going to pay for them. I'm willing to take a bet with anybody in the room who wants to take it that there will be, you know, the Afghans will get to the capability of running 168 Black Hawks sometime around 2000 never. It's just not going to happen. So we are being very silly there in terms of, you know, there's the longer discussion just about how we operate, how we field things. And again, it comes to our solution and our kind of pie in the sky desire. Well, we can't buy Russian stuff.
Well, however, in the interest of realism, of a different kind of realism, not strategic realism, but political realism, the reason why the helicopter platform was changed was because of Congress. It's not because of you know, foolish bureaucrats and generals. It's because it was a long-standing irritant. That not just the purchase of the platforms themselves, but you know, constantly having to do the waivers for the parts, and DoD, to its credit, resisted that for a very long time until it became politically irresistible.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame the DoD for it by any chance, and I think it's another indicator of just Congress's really kind of disengagement on this until, oh look, this thing sounds right, and
or engagement on a different set of concerns and interests that aren't about Afghanistan strategy per se, but have to do with Russia and have to do with spending and have to do with defense contractors.
But it does remind me that a lot of things we've talked about tonight, it's that we're just not very good at this kind of foreign, you know, for lack of a better word, kind of imperial activity. There's lots of constraints, the nature of our system. You know, you talked, Jason, about sending people on 9-month or 1-year rotations and then getting them back, is that we're not well suited for this. And actually, I think that's not a bug, that's a feature of our liberal democracy, is that we're not good at this. But it does mean that we have to face that this is a constraint. If we say we need to do generational warfare to achieve X goal, and we're not suited to do generational warfare, we probably shouldn't choose X goal.
Or you just have to accept that the transaction costs are high.
Right. Questions?
Jonathan Bidlack with the Institute for Spending Reform. Can you talk a little bit about how the fact that we didn't apprehend Osama bin Laden early on impacted sort of the way that things unfolded? Do you think that things would have been different, would have been more likely that we would have left earlier had we have accomplished that goal? And I guess the corollary to that is, do you think that some of the missteps that we took made it actually take longer to apprehend Osama bin Laden than we might have otherwise accomplished?
Are you talking about Iraq? Jason?
I think it's a fantastic question. I think you kind of nailed it. I mean, I think that existential angst in the back of all of our heads, you know, knowing that he was still out there, that we had not captured and killed the mastermind of those attacks. And I think one of the ironies is those of us in my generation who kind of grew up and spent the majority of their military careers at war, along with most of the older American public that remembers 9/11 and kind of that visceral fear. You know, one thing we complain that, you know, soldiers not born in 9/11 are very quickly going to be enlisting in the United States military and capable of going to Afghanistan. We complain about that, but on the same token, I think it's that distance from that visceral fear that is now might finally allow us to be a little more rational about this.
I mean, it's very tempting to say if we had caught bin Laden in the first days, maybe we just would have been out of there quickly, but I tend to think not. I mean, we did overthrow the government, create a vacuum in Afghanistan. And when you do that, the pressures to fill that vacuum in some way are pretty strong. And you have to remember, we started out fairly small in what the American commitment was to filling that vacuum, and tried to keep our footprint light and our commitment fairly small. But then what you're doing doesn't really work, so you do a little bit more, and you have a one thing leads to another that is really quite divorced from the question of bin Laden.
Over here.
Yes, my name is Juliet Adams, and I recently graduated with a master's in terrorism and security policy. Now, my question is that I've been at a lot of forums where I've actually heard Afghan officials, government officials speak, as well as laymen speak, and also US government officials. And the problem is not that the US can't do it, but the US does not listen, and the leadership that's required is not taken seriously to make it happen. So how could we get leadership at levels that will make it happen?
I don't think you should underestimate how hard a lot of Americans have worked to try to make positive things happen in Afghanistan at all levels. People at the embassy, people at USAID in the field, not obviously people in the military, bureaucrats in Washington. I'm not defending the results to say that, but I wouldn't underestimate the lack of effort and intention that was there, and well-meaning, and people trying to grapple with very hard decisions. Doesn't mean that the answers were fully satisfying or effective. So I don't know that it's so much a question, at least in my mind, of leadership, but of more systemic factors that impede good decision making.
Rachel.
Bill Goodfellow, Afghanistan Peace Campaign. One overriding question is, why would the Taliban want to negotiate, come to the negotiating table, if they either think they're winning or think that the Americans are leaving, or both? And Stephen Biddle wrote a piece last fall, very compelling, I thought, in which he argued that one reason is that the Taliban worried about state collapse, that the Afghan government is going to implode, and as he put it, they want to negotiate with the state while there's still a state to negotiate with. Otherwise, there was the danger that Afghanistan would look like Syria, and there would be a cycle, as we saw when the Soviets left, of just vicious civil war, and that's what the Taliban originally came in to counter. And how big an argument is that? I mean, do you agree with Biddle, and is that one reason the Taliban are coming to the table?
It is a reason that they themselves give. So you can choose or not to take it at face value, but it's very explicitly a reason that they themselves have offered for why they're interested in negotiating. And I would give at least some credit to the genuineness of that concern. They say that they don't want to, they're not looking to be the kind of pariah state that Afghanistan was in the 90s, that they want to be recognized as legitimate, to have international legitimacy and all the goodies that come from that. And I would give some credence to those positions. I think the main reason why they're negotiating is they are, in the same way that any party is ever negotiating in a scenario like this, which is they're testing the proposition that they might be able to achieve their objectives through a negotiation rather than through continuing the fight on the battlefield. And they have certain constraints on their ability to, sustain the fight over a very long period of time. They have been fairly successful, but it doesn't mean that there aren't some stresses and strains. And so they're testing that proposition that they can achieve their objectives in a way that gives them, that bolsters their legitimacy, that reinforces the narrative that they have been promoting all these years, that they are truly the protectors of the Afghan people. They are the Afghan state, after all, that was illegitimately overthrown by the foreign invaders. And if they, at this stage, if they don't succeed in getting what they want through the negotiations, they still have a plan B.
My name is Nadeem. I'm a journalist with Voice of America. Today there was a news item which said that the July presidential elections have been postponed. So regarding the negotiations that are happening, you must have seen, I'm sure you have seen Hamdullah Mohib's statement about the Viceroy, Khalilzad, the differences between that. When you look at it, the relations between the United States and Afghan government, where do they stand? Is the United States ready to have a setup, as Hamdullah Mohib pointed out? United States want to create a government and send or create or appoint Khalilzad as the Viceroy of Afghanistan. Does that conspiracy or whatever idea, whatever you may call it, does that have any chance that this is what United States wants in order to have negotiations with Afghan government?
There's absolutely no validity to that conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite unfortunate that it was publicly promoted by a senior Afghan official. There's a lot of talk among Afghans among Afghan political figures about the idea of an interim government, a caretaker government, given the elections that are delayed beyond the mandate of the current government. But the idea that the United States at this stage of the game wants to take more ownership of Afghanistan by putting in a viceroy rather than less ownership of Afghanistan by withdrawing flies in the face of all logic and political reality.
But I do think it's it's a very poignant example of just how utterly we've failed in messaging, right? We believe, right, in who we are and what we're doing. We know we're acting in good faith. The problem is we assume that everyone else has not only heard our side of the story, but has actually bought into it. And the reality is most of them haven't even heard our side of the story. And we are a very small competitor in a huge information field. But we just assume that because, well, we know everything we're doing, that they must know it, and they must impute goodwill on everything we do. So I think it's a great and telling example of how we've missed a lot of the fundamentals about how we approach this conflict.
So unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but we'll obviously be here during the cocktail hour. But I want to allow both of you to have a kind of final statement. Is there anything else you'd like to make sure quickly that our audience here and on the cameras can take home from your discussion about this?
Well, for one, I would say the one of the challenges here, and I very much am hard on the U.S. government, DOD, those of us in the Army and Marine Corps who went out there and did it, and I'm very critical. But what I want to make sure is that none of this was done out of ill will, right? And I would never impute ill will or bad intentions on behalf of anybody. And that's what makes this a fundamentally difficult challenge, is that you have a lot of well-intentioned people, but you don't have the kind of cohesive higher-level leadership that can help align objectives and intentions with reality and hold folks accountable. And so I think for us, I don't think we need to be pessimistic about our failure there, but I think we need to be much more humble about the limits of American power and about the ability of the tools of foreign policy that we have. We need to be very realistic about what those tools can achieve.
I would just say, even if you believe that there was a certain amount of American carelessness in how we have undertaken our activities in Afghanistan over the years, I would caution against carelessness in how we leave, because there's we've had a lot of effect there for good and ill. And I do think it's worth taking seriously the point that Senator Webb made about incurring some obligations as a result of your actions. You could look at that from a moral sense, but you could also look at it from a purely practical sense. We have had a certain effect on the situation. We do still have some broader interests in the region and related to terrorism concerns, related to other issues in Pakistan and elsewhere in the region. And if we're overly careless in how we exit from Afghanistan, we could risk compromising those interests. And it's going to take some real self-discipline on the part of the United States government, given how this negotiation between the U.S. and Taliban is going, not to declare that you have accomplished your objectives. I won't use the term mission accomplished, but
Yes. No banners,
diplomacy accomplished. Not to declare diplomacy accomplished too soon. We're in the end game, but it would be penny wise and pound foolish to rush the end game here.
And I think it's probably the case that influencers probably need to brace the American public for the fact that it's not going to be pretty in some cases when we do depart, and we will eventually depart. And I think what you're saying, and Jason, is that we ought to depart, but we should do it carefully. But we also have to, I think, paint that picture that it's not going to always be pretty, and not to necessarily allow that to, in a well-intentioned way, kind of incentivized to get us back into the same problems, because then we're in a cycle of kind of in and out and in and out. We kind of have to own some of the problems and say, sorry, we can't necessarily do much about it, but we'll try to be careful. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I think it's been an exciting panel. Obviously, our two guests just have a tremendous amount of expertise and knowledge about this, and I really appreciate you guys coming and talking with our group. But I think this is, the first of many attempts that we will make to try to help educate people about what's the right path forward in Afghanistan, as well as other parts of the world as we rethink American foreign policy, and in particular, America's military role in the world. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thanks.